children's mine had been found, although a trading depot was needed for a number of things to happen. Well, besides the request for needed supplies, of course. With the medical facilities better insulated. Next to be researched was the cookhouse. Well, if they received an illness due to the growing cold, they would end up in the nearest available medical facility anyway. And we could not have that, could we? As for the workers at the sawmill, the plan with that was, once they were done, a construction team would be sent to the children's mine to formally conduct business or negotiate for supplies. Well, however you want to put it, that's what it was for. And some supplies were needed more than others. Would be considerably low after the sawmill ran out. As for the workers from Hot Springs, they had arrived and there was enough beds in the infirmary to go around. They were all gravely ill, and not all of them made it on the journey. The one in charge of Hot Springs, well, their representative anyway, suggested safe routes. I could see the reason for that. Although I could also see a need for the children's mine to have a trading depot. as they likely had requirements of their own. I would need to allocate resources wisely. The automaton had some steel that could be salvaged, but no steam core. Yes, it was likely that would be the most valuable and easiest to carry. The springs, or what was left of them, was the next destination. Yes, the trading depot in the children's mine was built, and we could see what they required. Which were needs that were similar but different to hot springs. I requested some more steel. And made a start on accommodating their needs, as well as, well, having houses researched in preparation for what was coming for all of us. As bunkhouses were good for this point in time, but not good enough for the future. And the high pass was a busy trail. There was clearly signs of life along that route. Possibly another settlement. Likely quite different from either hot springs or the children's mine. And at that point we had ran out of wood. And a cemetery was written into law. As otherwise, disease would be spreading. As for where to build this cemetery, I decided to have it built far enough away to prevent disease, but close enough to allow for as much of the road leading to where the sawmill used to be salvaged for any wood that it had, because that way to the sawmill is no longer necessary, considering that by this point it was being dismantled. Hot springs had a dilemma with the safe routes. Either flood the caves to minimize the eruptions or create a borehole. One would increase the yields of food, the other would it was decided the borehole was the better option, at least from a diplomatic standpoint, because the moss that provided a sedative was considered more useful. Hope was higher than we first started here. And discontent almost non-existent. The springs that had once provided a haven for life were now frozen over and dead. As were any foolish enough to linger there. Another familiar place was also visited. But it would likely be the next day before that would happen. It would appear that some generators used convict labour to build them. Treated little better than animals. Not something that the former overseer of Site 113, now known as New Liverpool, did, thankfully, but others did. And those that realized that the promises were empty and they were used as slaves, well, the impossible suddenly becomes more attractive. for those with nothing to lose. In the distance there were signs of life. Signs of life that were worth looking into. As the convicts were not all in those cages or around there, which meant they weren't dead. Only their guards. Those that would have likely have left them to die. The settlement, far from Blythe's folly, was likely to be made of all these convicts. If we were still aligned with New London, it would likely be the case that they would be hostile towards us. As things stood by this point, they would be less likely to be hostile, knowing that we've broken from New London. And it was likely that these convicts weren't the excessively violent kind. Most of them were likely to have been sentenced to that or offered the chance to do that. Because of an altogether different crime. Likely to be theft. Something like that. Why not? Transportation. I believe that's what they did with some criminals. The house needed redesign in order to make the most of what we had. We requested food from hot springs. It was something we needed to keep on top of. As for the safe routes, workers needed to be diverted from other workplaces. in order for a construction team to be formed. Well, someone needs to establish this safe route. And a care home, or care house, well, a building that helps delay any possible deterioration of the physical condition was signed into law. Our people wanted to give the hot springs a proper cemetery, but Hot Springs wanted a composting pit to fertilize the soil. I agreed to the latter, even though some wouldn't like it. And the shipwreck... yes, the shipwreck camp. They had heating, although other things were in short supply. And indeed, they lowered their guard somewhat when they found out that we had rebelled against New London. The scouts were sent elsewhere. That was somewhere for the construction team that had been formed, or would be formed. Actually, yes, part of the safe route was completed, but 2 more stages remained. First, that could wait, as establishing a trading depot with the shipwreck camp was considered more important. Since the children's mine had coal, the hot springs had food, there was a hope that they had something else that was in short supply in Bly's Folly. And from the diplomatic and surprisingly reasonable attitude that the shipwreck camp's representative had, I was more convinced that many of them were there in the first place because they had committed some less violent criminal acts. Of course, there was a possibility that a few were just caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. and convicted of something that they didn't commit. Yes. The criminal justice system had its flaws. Yes, the forest or wood with the dead were buried. We couldn't before because of the preparations for the Great Storm. But there was time to do so by this point. The supplies gathered were delivered to Bligh's Folly, as most of the locations explored were thoroughly searched, and those scouts could be reassigned to a construction team. Yes, I thought that much. As one would soon be needed for the creation of the safe route between Bligh's Folly and Hot Springs. By this point, I saw little reason to have 4 workshops. All research at... Yes, there was a frozen sea just outside the shipwreck camp. There was a ship nearby. The scouts were sent there, likely to be how the convicts arrive, and it was possible that they weren't involved in the construction of New London or Winterhome, and judging by their accents, I doubted they were responsible for Tesla City. And with the house redesign completed, there was no need to have research done. At least, not by that point. The engineers were reassigned to improving the coal supply, either by working the coal thumper or by gathering it.
Gird your loins for work, people.
All the settlements, besides Blythe, Folly and New London, were found. Time would tell if there would be enough to stand against any punitive expeditions, if any.